The Indifferent Stars Above by Daniel James Brown is a nonfiction book about the Donner Party and specifically focuses on this one woman, Sarah Graves. I did read this alongside the Weirdo Book Club, and I had an awesome time interacting with everyone, getting their takes on what was going on, and I think that was truly a huge boon to this novel as a whole, because talking about what you're learning or what other people are picking up in something that's so dense helps you remember what you're reading, and it helps you identify different takeaways that different people have, which has kind of led me to my own standalone review, because as I was writing my January reading wrap-up, this thing took over like 10 pages of notes. I think the writer does an amazing job gaining immediate investment from the readers, and I also think he's particularly skilled about taking poetic phrases and incorporating them into what's otherwise factual nonfiction. But with that like generalized summary, let's talk about a couple specific points. If you listen to this story instead of reading it, I do think you are going to get a little bit lost. And this is coming from personal experience as someone who was familiar with the Donner Party and went into this sort of knowing some stuff already. There's still just so many names and places. It becomes quite difficult to keep everything separate if you don't like write it down and pay attention. And you know, part of this is because there's up to 80 people in the Donner Party and those people switch in and out. And part of this is because a lot of these people have the same first name. So it's very easy to forget like, which William are we talking about right now? But if you are listening to this story and need a little bit of a guide, here's some important folks. Lansford Hastings, he wrote the guidebook on how to immigrate over to Oregon or California. He made some shady business deals, and because of that, it led him to recommend something called Hastings Cutoff, which is what the Donner Party took. It was a trip right over the Rocky Mountains, and on the map, it looks like it cuts a ton of time off the trip. But in reality, because you're going through so many different harsh obstacles and there was no clear path cut, it was significantly longer and harder to trek that way than it would have been taking the standard trail. A thing Hastings would come to realize when he finally decides to try his own path. The Donner family. The family itself is led by two brothers. They have a ton of kids and several teamsters helping them out. Despite the fact that they were the party's leaders, they're not actually that important in this particular retelling of the tragedy of the Donner Party. Most of them stayed at camp, and their camp in the winter tragedy was so separate from everyone else's it took like a day to travel down to them. There are a few unique isolated horrors that we get a little bit in depth into later, but if you're focusing on Sarah Graves and her experience, you can kind of ignore the Donners altogether. The Graves family. When the tragedy of the Donner Party hits, they end up sharing a cabin with the Reeds, so if you're looking for that Graves-centered experience, you also want to pay attention to the Reeds. The Reeds are also sort of like an important family in and of themselves because there was so much activity going on in that family. Like a lot of things that happened down the road sort of involve them. I would focus in on Sarah's parents, Franklin Graves and Elizabeth Graves, as well as her younger sister Mary, who's 20 at the time of the tragedy. Those characters seem to have like a big impact and series of insights into what happened to Sarah Graves specifically. She does have a husband. He's important, but not as important as you would think. The Reed family. James Reed is important because he was leader of the party at one point in time before the Donners took it over, and like what happens to him and how he keeps playing in and out of the story affects a lot of things that will happen. I think his wife Margaret is also a pretty important character because she and Elizabeth spend a lot of time together. A lot of the other people here have their own individual dramas and tragedies happening. Certainly I would keep track of as many of those names as possible because they're all important in various different ways and they all impact each other's story. But I think if you can only remember a couple of names, those are the ones you should look out for and pay the most attention to if you're looking to get specifically Sarah's story. There's no good way to say this. If you don't know, the Donner Party mostly ate the remains of dead people, but there were two specific individuals that they murdered for consumption, and that's going to be Louis and Salvador. I think it's important to remember these two names not only because they were murdered by these other people, but I think they were murdered pretty callously and as a result of racism, given that they were two Native Americans from the Miwok tribe, and they were guides sent on a rescue mission to help people survive and travel through the Rockies, and this is how they were repaid. moving me into a segment I want to call Random History Time. Beyond a detailed and harrowing account of the Donner Party, there's a bunch of interesting little historical tidbits of information. Like, there's an incredible lack of knowledge about disease in this world. They didn't know that it was the mosquito bites that were making people sick in Illinois. They thought it was just the damp weather. And I mean, like, they're sort of kind of right, because the damp environment is what made it ideal for mosquitoes to breed, but it's not the wet all on its own. Possible cures for all kinds of things included drinking spider webs. Who was the first person who went out and collected spider webs? Were the spider webs cleaned, or did they have like bug particles in them? Like, just so many questions. For starters, douching was a practice, and they used baking soda and vinegar like some 6th grader's volcano experiment. Just cannot get over. And even though these people understood that sex led to pregnancy, they did not understand the mechanics of conception or the different phases of pregnancy. So a lot of early signs that a woman was pregnant, like bloating, fatigue, morning sickness, were all attributed to like illnesses, and it was encouraged that they get rid of those illnesses any way possible, which actually led to a lot of early abortion techniques where the women didn't know they were aborting children. Or possibly those women did understand that, like it was something they whispered in their own little secret circles, but like as a larger society, that's not how this practice was viewed. It was viewed that these women were actually sick and that they needed to do whatever they could to cure the sickness, which in this case would be an abortion of some kind. And I was sort of mesmerized reading this because on one side, I know that people were more pro-life back then than they are now. Their lack of knowledge ended up making them actively look more pro-choice. Based off of where we are in America right now with the women's right to choose and all that kind of stuff, it makes me be in this weird place where actually being more ignorant gave these women more freedom and opportunities than having the knowledge would. I mean, I guess not technically, because presumably if these people weren't currently immigrating on a trail, they probably did want to have families, and they were probably accidentally getting in the way of that by doing all these things to cure illness. And I guess I'm not really for that either. Like, a woman's right to choose means that she can either choose to get pregnant or not get pregnant, or end a pregnancy on her own terms, not that like anyone's ignorance or anyone else's decision about what's right for them gets to impact that. But even like talking that out right now, it still put me in a very weird place reading it, and makes me feel very weird about the whole situation where like it was a lot more acceptable to have abortions back then than it is now in some ways, even though they weren't aware that's what they were doing. Also, we got a lot of great insight about how death was handled at this point in time. So a death industrial complex as we know it now, where you go to somebody, you pay them for a coffin and a funeral, and they treat the body, all of that happened during Civil War era, when there were so many dead bodies and they had to be treated before they were sent back to their families. At this point in time, in a pre-Civil War era, death was handled by the family on an individual person-to-person basis. So they would create the box, they dig the hole, they would preserve or not preserve the body as best they could. They would do a viewing. The viewing would last a while because people were not confident that their loved one was dead, and this gives them time to revive before they get buried in the ground. Which is interesting to me all in and of itself, because I've been doing so much Edgar Allan Poe reading and research, and you know, a common theme of his is that you have buried someone alive, which I just thought was a quirky fear Edgar Allan Poe had, but there's actually a lot of really good reason you might be afraid of that. This is sort of a random observation, but there were a ton of blended families in the Donner Party. Wives who were second wives, or wives where they were on their second husband, and the husbands either had stepchildren they had with their first wife, or the wives had stepchildren they'd have with their first husband, and they blended the whole family together in like this big group, which is very interesting because we always talk about an American traditional family, and we're really only talking about a very specific idealized thing that existed like in the 1950s only. I think it was a little startling to me to realize just how much of a temporal myth that is. For some reason, I was under the impression that we would find a lot of man, woman, children couples in this time period. That's not the case. It's like man, woman, their children, previous marriage children, all blending into a big family. And even here in the Donner Party, they have a woman who is traveling as a widow with a bunch of children, and it sounds like she had at least 2 husbands before being widowed, and possibly like her first child was born out of wedlock. I cannot confirm or deny that, based off of what this book has given us or based off of any research I've done on my own, but it's sort of like fascinating and like a small little microcosm that you could fall into. And I was sort of struck by like the astounding level of ignorance to all kinds of stuff. Reading the story about these families trying to travel to California really threw me back to first grade and the first time I ever played the game, the Oregon Trail. Because they were decisions I made on the Oregon Trail as a first grader with no knowledge about anything. Like how far they had to travel, fording a river, what a wagon was like, what oxen were like no experience with any of that. And my decisions were still more informed in a lot of ways than what these people had to go off of. Like if someone got sick, I knew when to rest. I knew to leave earlier than these people ever left on their own journey. I assumed that if you had to pay more to cross a river than to do it on your own, there was good reason for that and chose that option. I knew it was better to have too much food than not enough. And to be fair, like as a kid playing this video game, I didn't have to worry about like setting up shop in California or Oregon or having any extra money to get started in a new life over there. So these people had concerns that I wouldn't have had as a video game player. But at the same time, like what I knew about the cold and hypothermia and what that means for people, there's a complete absence of understanding about dying of cold. And that does come into play later in their tragedy because they thought that people were dying of hunger. And revealing all of these facts and everything they did not know that was basic knowledge even to like first grade me, and of course even now I know so much more than they ever did, makes me sort of reflective about what is it that we do not know right now that in a couple hundred years someone will look back on us and be astounded that wasn't common knowledge. Which rolls me into a conversation about generalized nutrition facts. So pretty much everyone knows the Donner Party was traveling to California and got snowed in on the Rocky Mountains and slowly was like starving to death to a point of extremity where they started to eat humans to survive. And naturally, something that would get paired hand in hand with that is a lesson on basic nutrition, calorie in, calorie out, all that kind of stuff. But I really appreciate that this author broke down how much these people weighed, how many calories they would have been using on a day-to-day scenario, how under calorie budget they had been because of how hard they had been working on the trail up to this point. So they were already sort of like without reserves to start. And then of course they were also without physical supplies. So everything was sort of working against them. And the continual hard work of day-to-day survival driven a higher caloric consumption than like your average person today. But this book also explains how the body makes energy, which if you don't know, we convert carbohydrates and sugars into energy. But if you don't have carbs and sugar for some reason, your body has a secondary system called ketosis where it will take fat stores or fat found in food and convert that over into carbs and sugars to use as energy. This means though that you need to either be eating sugar, carbs, or fat. There are health risks to being in ketosis. Your blood can literally turn acidic and kill you. Now modern day, if you're eating keto and burning fat or whatever, you're highly unlikely to get acidic blood. But if you're in a survival situation like the Donner Party was, where your body converts over out of need, then there's a lot of factors running against you that could endanger you. The Donner Party was starving from malnutrition long before the food ran out. Like they were eating these extra lean, high protein oxen. The protein wasn't doing anything for them because they didn't have the carbs, the sugar, or the fat that was necessary to actually make the energy. And because of that, their body was like tearing itself apart, eating any extra fat that they could find, but even like starting to eat its own muscles and stuff to like keep them alive and moving. The other thing that the author does is talk about what it means to go several days without hunger, how that changes your brain chemistry, your focal point, how it makes you tired and lethargic, but it also like gives you brain fog, makes it hard for you to focus and concentrate, makes it so that you're not capable of making good decisions past a certain point without food. And I mentioned just before, but another thing that this book goes into is the understanding of both nutrition and cold and survival. So these people people primarily were dying of exposure, but the Donner Party did not know that. They thought that everyone was dying of starvation, so it probably seemed to them like more urgent that they find some kind of food somewhere, anywhere, to keep going, because otherwise they would be the next person to die of starvation. Perhaps the most integral part about why the Donner Party turns to cannibalism so soon, like if you look at the tale, how many days, all of the calorie deficits, all of that, none of it adds up until you realize that they were looking at everyone else dying around them and thinking it was specifically from starvation, and they were the next to go from that. There's also a little bit in this book about manifest destiny and the Trail West. This is a particularly dark time in American history. It's very propaganda heavy, it's incredibly racist. This book doesn't shy away from any of that. It does talk about like American revolutionaries, and they're really more like bandits, extreme violence they're willing to commit against Mexicans and like Mexican governmental officials, often people who surrendered to them or who were perhaps open to becoming American versus Mexican territory. There's one particularly grotesque scene that sort of like foreshadows the cannibalism that's to come in a way that's upsetting on all fronts. Also, there's like pretty decent detail about all of the Native American people that are depicted. First of all, this author tackles why the Graves family specific was probably especially prejudiced against Indigenous people because they'd just gone through some kind of like rebellion revolt with a specific tribe, and how afraid the Graves family and others in the area must have felt about that. They don't ever shy away from the fact that the colonists were especially brutal to these Indigenous people, and honestly some of the issues and tensions going on there were the colonists' fault. The Native Americans had wanted to surrender and were not allowed for the longest, and more like slaughter and brutality happened to them than was necessary. So I appreciated all of that accuracy, even when using that as an explanation as why these colonists were racist. Like, they were racist just to start, but they also had this bad event. Even though the author called out different tribes and their different attitudes about the immigrants heading west, from the colonist perspective, they were all the same lesser kind of people. I especially liked it because I'm a big consumer of any history or information I can get on Crazy Horse, and this is sort of close enough to that time period where I have some familiarity. That was a big connecting piece for me. I would have liked more because I'm always really curious about the Native American perspective and culture and history, but I think this author did a really good job since it's centered on the Donner Party and Sarah Graves' experience specifically, describing what happened to them and perhaps giving a little bit more context about why that did or didn't happen that way. And of course, these two topics lead me into like the blatant racism of the colonial people at this time. Even though the Donner Party didn't really interact with Mexicans as they traveled westward, because we're getting this background about the manifest destiny and how the American soldiers are interacting with these Mexicans, and we're getting this information about how these immigrants are interacting with the native people and their past experience with the native people, and a little bit of conflict going on between the natives, their land, and these sort of like travelers who are like basically trespassers. All of that kind of like culminates into us understanding that these people did not view other races as human. There's to me two very extreme examples of this. One is going to have like some American rebel forces facing off against the Mexican people, where they end up tying them to a pole and killing them in a very gruesome way that was literally torture before the end for no reason, because these people really didn't have any power to fight back or ability to really give them what they wanted. And then of course there's how the snowshoe party hunted down Lewis and Salvador of the Miwok tribe, killed them, and these two people had gone to help them and to be guides to them. They had refused to partake in cannibalism when the snowshoe party had started eating their dead. They'd separated from the party, probably afraid of exactly this thing happening, and these people hunted them down and killed them in cold blood. It's a thing that ends up being especially awful and tragic because the snowshoe party eventually stumbles upon some other Indigenous people, and these Indigenous people help them, nurse them back to health, and get them back to their people. It really, to me, sort of suggested that it was more than just inherent tribalism, because we're often excusing racism or excusing this othering tribal atmospheres, like, well, everyone sort of sticks to their own tribe and is distrustful of the other. Not in the same way, not to the same degree or the same level. This Native American tribe could have ignored these dying white people. It could have killed them the same way that they had killed those two Miwok guides. What they did when they saw these people in this desperate state, they recognized their humanity, they recognized how easily this could be them, and they reached out and they helped. The little bit we get of the Mexican-American War and hostilities going on there, we do get a look at one of the Mexican officials, and he's sort of considering the pros and cons and leaning towards America taking over California and Oregon. When the rebels come to his door, he welcomes them, gives them authority, they write up a treaty, they all celebrate together. They still lock this guy up at the end. He complied, and they were still awful. So like seeing the actions of the colonial white people of the time, and then having like this further disharmony because you know that like colonization and whiteness was considered like the civilized, more humane way, and then seeing how inhumanely they treated these people, how other they treated this people. There was not cultural context or language for the way they were treating them. Like, you can say that when Native Americans attacked villages, they burned everything down and scalped people, but they were treating those American colonies the same way they would treat another tribe. They weren't treating them with a special cruelty or a special level of benevolence, which is not the same thing you can say for the Western people when they confronted them. And I think it strips bare a lot of those excuses about how people are distrustful of what's different, how we're tribal by nature, how we're likely to other people. This kind of treatment and cruelty goes beyond that and should not be excused. Another interesting for me was comparing like human greed with modern corporate greed, because the Donner Party tragedy is a result of many things, but not the least of which is Hastings' shortcut, something he recommended because he had a stake in getting more people into California, and he just saw on a map this would be faster. Never even tried it or confirmed it before recommending. And in fact, a journalist had tried Hastings Cutoff like a couple weeks before and written a paper about how incredibly unsuitable it was. But the fort that's right before Hastings Cutoff had suppressed that paper because if people didn't go to Hastings Cutoff, there'd be no reason to visit that fort, and he wanted some money and commerce too. At one point in time, before corporations, we just had individuals self-interested in themselves, out for greed and fame and glory. And they made decisions that killed people and were awful, just like these corporations do. So it's not a lack of humanity in corporations necessarily that does this. This has always been inherent in human society. And the same kind of restrictions we put on people to help protect the public from this sort of like greed and interest, we need to like go back to that well and start enforcing that in corporations as well. Something I hadn't known anything about before reading this book was the lives of these characters after the Donner Party tragedy, and that takes up a lot of the book, and it is definitely like all really well researched, written, interesting things to think about. I think it really speaks to the resilience of humanity, and specifically most of these westward immigrants, that they like went on to lead lives, lots of them successful, happy ones. Last but not least, I think this book does a great job with some survivalist takeaways should you ever find yourself out in the wild, because overwhelmingly the people who survived this tragedy were women. And this book explores the many factors that might have led to so many more women than men surviving the tragedy. I mean, first of all, if we go biological differences, women historically have more fat on them than men do, so they had more fuel and resources like stored up to burn. And also, while caravan life was hard for women on the Oregon Trail, it was even harder on the men. In particular, these men had to cut down a bunch of trees to build log cabins and to fuel fires. Women did hard work too, but it wasn't as calorically demanding as the things the men were doing. Also, a woman's body appears to be better than a man's at regulating temperature. Generally, women are smaller than men, so they also have more efficient circulatory systems, all that kind of stuff. A woman's role on the Oregon Trail was to buy and control the supplies for their wagon, so they had a better idea of inventory and closer access to it than the men did. Most of the cannibalism that happened during the Donner Party tragedy was on dead bodies. However, there was a moment where the snowshoe party was talking about having duels and killing people off to feed on them, and when they talked about that. It was about the men drawing straws. Like, the women had been left out of that entirely, which sort of like suggests that if it had come to that, the women would have had that extra layer of protection that these men folk just did not have. Also, families and communities just historically do better in periods of crisis than a lone person does. And all of the women in this trail were tied into some sort of family unit. Even the widows had younger children that were relying on them, as well as often adult children with families of their own that they could communicate with. These kind of communities can share burdens better, they can give everyone jobs so that like more things can get done with more efficiency, they can share resources, they're better able to research, learn gossip and information, and they're able to like buoy each other's spirits. And it does seem like mental attitude played a big role in whether or not one survived this Donner Party tragedy, so women were inherently set up as more likely to survive this than men were. That's everything that stuck out to me in The Indifferent Stars Above. It was an amazing little nonfiction. It tackled so many different thoughts, feelings, theories, opinions. It made me glad to be alive now, despite all the turmoil the US is in at the moment. I think it's great for history buffs, and I think it's great just for like the layperson to read too. And if you got this far into the video, the secret sign is going to be a snowflake emoji. And as always,